I think that there is an element within the DA of people in the DA who see themselves as they've given up the aspiration of being like a mass party. I think they see themselves as, being this kind of almost, purified DA. And, they are happy to maybe, because there's also, they're happy to just kind of rule in the Western Cape, for example. But it is also, I think there also is a question, I think they also is very much, they are in this weird kind of online bubble as well. Because I also think that, it's become this kind of self-fulfilling thing. And I think, as William mentioned, I don't see how this is going to be such a winning electoral strategy.
So one of the sort of contradictions of the DA, or if you want, like a tension within the DA, that I think, and the image that we put up is of like the DA also has Black supporters. One question we have is like, when you look at South Africa, people tend to map the left-right political axis on the basis of race. But, the three of us know that that's not necessarily the case. And perhaps like politics of xenophobia is perhaps the best example of this. And just by to ask this question, in one state, Herman Mashaba, who was the mayor of Johannesburg and was a DA mayor, I mean, he's now since left the DA, while he was mayor, he was openly hostile to migrants and targeted them during his tenure. And if people are interested, you should read the piece on the website called Herman Mashaba Wants You to Forget, because he's now trying to run a different political parties, sort of refashioning himself. And he was once part of the DA before he resigned about spat over racial transformation. Can you say something about this other part of sort of the right in South Africa, that it's not always necessarily, we pointed out this kind of white ecosystem of the right, but there's also the way that they are connecting now. And South Africa is a Black majority country. As like you see some of these ideas now also filtering into the Black majority, or it probably has been there all along.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and thanks for bringing that up. I've actually got a new article coming out about this phenomenon in New Frame next week, just to sort of find myself. But yeah, and with like Herman Mashaba is a really good example, because him, and there are also a lot of kind of smaller groups as well here, which are expressing this very much kind of South Africa first sentiment, and they are very much using a lot of this kind of language. But what's also interesting in the South African case is that they also draw on, sort of nationalist and leftist critiques, but to justify xenophobia. So what they'll do is, for example, is, claim, for example, that, South African sovereignty is very, very important as a post-colonial country, and, allowing immigrants in from other African countries is an insane double standard. It's just, and so what happens is that language is, it's not necessarily articulated in a way that we would see it as, part of, like, for example, the white right wing, but there's definitely that overlap. But I think what's happened now in South Africa is quite a disturbing thing, where you're starting to see this kind of right populism, which is articulated through xenophobia, but it addresses real questions. So it will acknowledge, for example, poverty in South Africa and how poverty is racialized and things like that. But then the solution is the kind of Bannonite solution, where, it's supposedly you get Fortress South Africa, you'll deal with all the kind of political problems. And I think, just to add on that as well, I think a big problem in SA is that and has a very sort of problematic attitude with xenophobia, because they'll report on sort of xenophobic incidents, but they sort of use the illegal immigrants kind of rhetoric, and they sort of continue to normalize it. So I think that's something that's definitely sort of emerging, but it's not necessarily in conversation with this kind of white right, but I feel that they're not mutually opposed to each other at all either. I think they're kind of projects which can run parallel to each other.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, you mentioned one of these movements that are cropping up, the Put South African First movements, the hashtag Put South African First movement. And what I find so interesting about this iteration of xenophobia and nationalism, as you've already alluded to, is that the class composition of this is like quite sort of middle class, right? In the sense, and it tries to distinguish itself from earlier waves of xenophobic violence in the country by marketing it as being more enlightened, respectable, and cosmopolitan, and non-threatening, right? As is the as is the strategy of a lot of South Africa's right wing as well. And I mean, what do you think is happening here? And I think a related question raised in the comments by Katarina is the parallel to ADOS in the US, which is the movement where people who claim to be the rightful descendants of slaves, right? Where basically it's this pivot that is about being enlightened, right? About being learned and making sort of considered arguments in favor of a position, rather than being this outburst of frustration or insecurity, and finding an audience for that on social media with people who are well versed at making these arguments and who will go to great lengths to do so.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for really raising it. And I mean, the ADOS one is a really interesting parallel because just an example I noticed recently. So there's a pretty small group called Black Land First in South Africa. And it was a breakaway from the EFF. And they have I can't really go into the details, but they have a pretty unsalubrious past. But just to give an example, so recently I've seen on some of their online things, they've been, combining these sort of, calls for land redistribution in South Africa and things like that, and sort of using kind of decolonial language, but then also, endorsing these absolutely wild theories about things like the Rothschilds and things like that. And I think what's happened is that if you look at the history of fascist and reactionary politics in the 20th century, there was always been this process of a kind of creep. Sort of authoritarian politics draws on left-wing or progressive ideas to sort of legitimate itself. And I think what's happening now with this kind of new wave of xenophobia, which, as you said, is quite a bit more sophisticated, is that it's addressing things which are very true about South Africa. Like South Africa has, massive unemployment. It feels like it's a non-viable society for so many people living here. And I think what they're doing is that they are drawing on, very real sort of social pain that's there, and making this kind of visceral connection, but then just offering this absolutely really, really disturbing sort of solution, which is just going to result in kind of more violence. But I also think something I have noticed as well is the media coverage of this new kind of more sort of South Africa first trend has been, I think, pretty shoddy, because it's often taken these groups at their word. So it'll, for example, in the article I've got coming out next week, there's a quote from a newspaper article, and they say that they asked the rally, or there was a small rally outside, I think, the Union buildings, and it had like very rabidly sort of xenophobic sentiments. There was about 100 people there. And then they asked the organizers, and the organizers said, no, we're not xenophobic. It's just about crime. And that's sort of reported in the news report without kind of qualification. So, I think it's quite disturbing, because I think it's something that could have, I think the kind of white right-wing politics is much more going to be in these kind of white sort of enclaves and kind of cultural enclaves. But I think this kind of right populist xenophobia is something that needs to be really, really looked at very closely in South Africa, because I think it has a chance to really get a lot of political influence.